Bueno, es para mí un gusto presentar el día de hoy, moderar la sesión. I will be switching to English because we may have people today or in the future wanting to listen to this conference. So, but still, I would like to say a couple of things which are more local. Philippe van Basshuysen, something like that. So he holds a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he was once exchange student here at UNAM in 2013, and he has been coming back. And he will be here at the Institute until the end of the month. So, and he's working from my office. He doesn't come like every day for the whole day. But still, if you're interested in talking to him, I think it's good that you know that he will be around. He's professor of public health ethics at Leibniz University in Hannover. His research is at the intersection of ethics and the philosophy of science. And he is a principal investigator of the ERC, this is the European Research Council, starting grant, managing performative science. And if you can see the details of his project in his homepage, I think that is here at the Institute, we all got the link for that. And of course, any other person can go with him and you will find his profile. The acronym actually of his project is MARS.
MAPS.
Oh, it's MAPS. Sorry, I'm really sorry. Managing Performative Science. Okay, and his talk today, actually a draft paper was distributed. This has already been reviewed, but do not circulate it to them, please, because this is still very draft. And he's investigating how is that scientific models do not merely represent but can change the world, and how we should evaluate and manage this capacity. Besides that paper, I'd like you just to point to you to other papers, because he had been working during COVID, precisely analyzing some of the COVID model. And he has two other papers that is related to this. One is in the Philosophy of Medicine journal, and the title is When is Lockdown Justified? And the other one is in the Erasmus Journal for Philosophy and Economics. And the title is 3 Ways in Which Pandemic Models May Perform a Pandemic. And finally, I just want to mention that yesterday I found another paper of yours, which refers to Austin. This philosophy of language, saying, if I remember well, he has this book, How to Do Things with Words. And so maybe we can think of how to do things with maps, with models. It's just that I was just thinking, and I mentioned this a couple of days, that one question is whether maps are models. Well, that's so. Well, still, I think I will give you the floor now, and he will be presenting, as you can see in the slides, how performativity can be good for science. So, Philippe, welcome, and to the Institute, to this session, and we can start.
Thank you very much, Atocha. Is it okay if I present from here? Can you see that also online? Okay, good. So thanks a lot for this really kind introduction. And perhaps more generally speaking, thanks also for receiving me so kindly here at this institute at the not only this time, but every time I'm here. And it's really a pleasure to be here. One of the things I particularly like when I'm here is that I walk around quite a bit on this lovely campus, especially around the institute, and I talk to a couple of people, and somehow being here brings me into a state of mind in which I can really, think and focus on ideas and, develop ideas, develop papers and so on, which is something that, in my day-to-day job, there's often simply not enough time between, teaching duties. I'm sure you know the problem very well, and administrative things, but somehow here, this really works for me. And so this time has been no exception. And so the paper I'm going to present here today is, it's this: how performativity can be good for science. And so it's a paper that I've been revising during my stay here. It's a paper, it's still a work in progress, but it already has kind of a history. So I started working on these ideas actually during my last stay here in Mexico. And then the paper was under review for a very long time. And then I finally received some very extensive comments from 2 reviewers, which were actually very helpful, but also very substantial, very critical. And again, so when coming here, I finally found the time and energy to, start revising, start thinking about these things again. It's not a finished project yet, and you will see that this is really a paper with, edges and gaps. But I think the ideas are really beginning to come together. And I think there's some interesting things to be said here. Okay, so the paper is called, working title: How Performativity Can Be Good for Science. It's, as Atocha mentioned already, it's part of a bigger project, which is funded by the European Research Council with a starting grant. So thanks also to the ERC for funding this. And as you said, so the project is called MAPS. This is our logo. MAP stands for Managing Performative Science. So not surprisingly, this is also about the notion of performativity. And so you will see later on how this paper kind of relates to the bigger project of managing performativity. Okay, so with that, I think can start. Well, maybe I'm not sure what the kind of standard format of this of the seminar is, but so feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions, if anything is not entirely clear. Okay, so this is my plan. So there will be 3 parts. This presentation, I will first talk a little bit about the notion of performativity, this phenomenon. So I'm sure, there are lots of philosophers of science in this room, so I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this concept, but nevertheless, just so we're all on the same page, I'll say a few words about performativity, its history, and the kind of present state of the debate, because I think that there have been some interesting recent developments on this concept in the philosophy of science. And you will see that these developments are kind of important for my project. Okay, secondly, I will talk about performative power. So this is kind of a novel conceptual framework that I want to introduce to the philosophy of science. So a novel way of thinking about performativity. And then thirdly, I want to kind of use that framework, apply it to think about kind of a re-evaluation of the role performativity should have in science. And I will especially link it to debates on values in science. Okay, so especially some of the work of Helen Longino. Okay, so this is really the how performativity can be good for science part. Okay, so performativity, what is that? What is that about? So, well, typically, science is typically thought to describe the world, right? So to provide explanations, predictions, models, representations, which in the best case are, of course, true to the facts. However, very often science and scientists also kind of influence the very things they aim to describe. Okay, and this phenomenon is becoming, I think, increasingly widespread. So, for example, just to give you a couple of examples, so in economics, predictions of bank failures have led to bank runs, which then made the bank actually fail. This picture is a recent example. Remember the Silicon Valley Bank, I think, that failed two years ago, I think. In the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that epidemiological predictions of the spread of the disease influenced social distancing, but also policy making. Led to the implementation of lockdowns, for example, and that in turn kind of influenced the course of the pandemic. This is actually, as Atocha mentioned, this is actually the case that made me start thinking about this concept of performativity. And in computer science, so sexy topic right now, so predictive algorithms, increasingly influence things like whether you're hired, granted a loan, or denied parole. So in all these cases, and these are just random examples, scientific models are performative, meaning they influence the targets that they're supposed to describe. Okay. I will say a bit more about I mean, this is not a definition. This is just to give you an intuition. I'll say a bit more about how to define the concept later on. Now, historically speaking, philosophers and also scientists themselves have viewed performativity as something like a threat for science. Okay, and I will here simply provide a couple of examples for that view. So, first example is Oskar Morgenstern, famous economist, who had this pretty much 100 years ago, very interesting argument. So he argued that performative effects actually make predictions in the social sciences altogether impossible. Okay, so very pessimistic conclusion. I think it's way too pessimistic, but his argument is quite, for the conclusion, is quite interesting. So he focused on economic predictions, so like macro predictions of the business cycle. Okay, so of the economic development of particular country. And so he argued that once you publish such a prediction, the following will happen. So households, but also businesses, will then adapt to the predicted events, for example, by changing the decisions concerning their production, their output, but also pricing. Households will change their decisions concerning their consumption, and so on. And so this will then change what's going to happen, right? But this will in turn make your initial prediction come out false. Okay, so that's basic problem. And then of course it wouldn't help to then simply issue a second prediction, right? Because what's going to happen once you publish a second prediction? Well, they will again adapt their behaviors and change pricing, change output, change consumption, and so on. So you would end up in a potentially infinite series of false predictions. Okay, and so this, according to Morgenstern, makes economic predictions altogether impossible. Okay, second example. So Robert Merton, famous. So this is Robert K. Merton. So that's the father, not the son. So he had a very famous son who is an economist. He actually won the Nobel Prize, I think, in economic sciences. And there's some interesting twists between the two, but we can maybe talk about this in the discussion. But anyway, so famous sociologist, he kind of added to these epistemic worries of Morgenstern that there can also be ethical problems, political problems relating to performativity. Okay, so it can be very undesirable social consequences, and so he focused on prejudices, especially prejudices about racial minorities. which then can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay, so for example, suppose there's the prejudice that some minority is more prone to engage in criminal behavior. Okay, then for various reasons, this might become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and so might actually reinforce the criminal behavior within that group. Okay, so individuals will actually become more prone to individual behavior, and that's obviously ethically problematic. And this shows, according to Merton, that performativity is not only an epistemic threat to social science, but is also more broadly a threat to society. Okay, so we have one economist, sociologist. What about philosophers? There would be various possible examples, but I think nice one is hacking, right? Who I would argue he's also broadly kind of in this tradition of performativity as a threat. So of course he doesn't talk about performativity as such, but about his famous looping effects, right? So he kind of refocuses the debate from predictions more to classifications of humankinds. But I would kind of subsume that under the broad notion of performativity as well. And but so what's important for my purposes is simply that, so according to hacking, looping effects are also kind of a threat because they're very hard to predict and really elusive for social science, at least for current social science. So quite a similar view to Morgenstern's view, I would argue. And now this view of performativity as a threat is, I think, still very prominent today. So here's a recent example from Eric Winsberg and Stephanie Harvard, who argued that performative science is often manipulative and anti-democratic. I won't go into the details of these arguments, but also happy to talk about that in the discussion. Okay, but now note that there's an alternative view, which I think is gaining some traction. And I think the first one to make this view really explicit was Francesco Guala, a philosopher of economics, who had this paper. It's actually not that recent, the paper, but for some reason I think it didn't receive the attention it deserved until quite recently. So in this paper, he's interested in experimental economics, and so he identified two broad traditions within experimental economics, which he called the testers and the builders. Now, what is that all about? So the testers believe that, as the name suggests, that experiments are primarily supposed to test theory, okay? But then within that view, performativity is really a threat. Why? Well, because it can lead to experimental bias. Okay, that's the argument. So as an example, so the classic worry is that when you take economics students as participants in your experiments, and that's what economists typically do, right? So econ undergrad students, then the worry is that these students somehow behave differently to normal people. Right? They might be more selfish, more rational, and that's precisely because they've been previously exposed to economic theory. Right? So the threat is that, or the concern is that they've been performed by the theory already, but then that leads to experimental bias, right? When you use them as experimental subjects. Okay, so that's testers. Very much in line with this performativity as a threat concept. Now, in contrast to that, the builders, they take a very different approach. So builders would actually welcome it when behavior aligns more with economic theory. Why? Well, because then you can exploit the theory to do things, right? Especially to design reliable institutions. Okay, so here performativity is used kind of as a tool. I think he used that word, performativity as a tool to design things like markets, auctions, contracts, etc. If that works, then we should be happy about people being performed by the theory. Okay, so that's essentially his argument. But then, I mean, till here it's pretty much a descriptive analysis of these two traditions within experimental economics. But then he also argues that the builders kind of win this battle within economics. And that's precisely because they've learned how to use performativity as a powerful resource, whereas the testers haven't. Okay. Okay, so here, rather than viewing performativity as a threat, it's really as something like a tool to do things with the economy. Now, as I mentioned, for some reason, this paper didn't really receive a lot of attention until recently, but then starting in the 2020s, some people have made similar arguments. Here's a list of papers. It's not a complete list, and this list is currently growing, so of papers that kind of made similar arguments in various contexts, arguing for that, performativity might have some productive, constructive roles to play within science. So in my paper from 2021 that Atocha kindly mentioned, I focused on epidemiological models during the COVID pandemic. Inquiry Koskinen has an interesting paper on focusing on the performative effects, and in this case, desirable performative effects of activist research. Ortmann and White focus on climate economics. There's a paper by Vergara Fernandez and some co-authors focusing on financial economics. So I think this view is gaining some traction. Okay, so calling for kind of a reevaluation of performativity. Okay. Now, so this is how I see kind of the present state of the debate. Now, my project that I'm going to present here is how does that relate to this kind of debate? Well, so perhaps not surprisingly, I'm pretty much in the tradition of overcoming the received view. But so what I want to do is also something more than that. So I want to provide kind of a novel conceptual framework, especially by introducing this concept of performative power, and then by using that framework, explore links to the broader literature on on values in science. Okay, so I see this as a bit of a broader project. Okay, and so the next kind of two parts are associated with kind of these 2 points, right? So next I want to give kind of my conceptual contribution, and then kind of try and use it to argue for a reevaluation of performativity. Okay. So second part, how am I doing with time?
I thought I said like 50 minutes. We started at 10 past 12. So you have like 25 minutes.
Okay. Okay, that should be fine, I think. Yeah. Good. So performative power. So let's start by taking a kind of a closer look at performativity. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning, so I gave a couple of examples, but not really a definition. If you look at definitions in the literature, you will find things like this. So this is a definition by Jakob Ortmann in a forthcoming paper. So he defines scientific models, theories, and predictions as performative whenever their publication or their dissemination changes their fit with the intended target. Okay? And you will find, similar definitions in the literature. I like this one because I think it's quite intuitive and clear. And I think it's perfectly fine as a kind of working definition for my purposes. Let me just add a couple of observations here. So note that as Ortmann explicitly does, so you can, kind of attribute performativity to various kinds of scientific entities or results. Okay, so Ortmann mentions models, theories, predictions, but you could also mention other kind of scientific results like explanations, what have you, concepts, graphs that might, whose publication might change the model target fit. Okay, and I will sometimes simply use prediction kind of as a placeholder for all these entities. But I think most of what I'm going to say will hold for other results and entities as well. But let me just say prediction. Okay. Secondly, so what does change in model target fit mean? Well, it can mean various things. I think the standard example is really a change in the truth value of your prediction, as it happens when you have a self-fulfilling or a self-defeating prediction, right? So that's, I think, the classic case of performativity. I don't think it's the only case. I think you can also have something like a change of the probability distribution, or of the probability of your prediction being true, even if it doesn't really change the truth value in the end. Yeah, I would argue that, here you also have a kind of a change in the model target fit that should count as performative. And there might be other kinds of mechanisms that can also change the model target fit. Okay, last remark is that so performativity can be brought about through different mechanisms or different channels of transmission, as Melissa Vergara-Fernandez calls it. So, for example, these can be, kind of spontaneous behavioral changes as a response to some publication of a prediction. So think of the bank run case again. So, this becomes public and then suddenly clients of the bank will, demand their money all at once. And then that leads to the actual bank fail. That would be a spontaneous case. This could also be something more kind of indirect, so mediated by, through institutional design or policy making. I think the COVID case might be a case of, some more indirect mechanisms. So when you have a prediction of, so and so many deaths, and as a response, lockdown will be implemented, and that in turn changes behavior. So that would be an indirect case. In many cases, and that kind of complicates the thing, these two or various mechanisms kind of go together in intricate ways. We were also struggling with that in our COVID paper, because there you had, so one observation was that even before lockdowns were implemented, people were already changing their behavior. So by, increasing social distancing, for example. But then the lockdown in turn increased, further increased that kind of behavior. So these mechanisms can kind of come together or even, pull in different directions. But that's not really so important for my project here. Just something to note. But now my main point here is the following, and this is, I think, something that it's actually quite obvious, but it hasn't really been. It's not really an observation that has been made in the literature, and it's the following. So one and the same prediction can have very different effects. Okay, so for example, so if I predict that, say, Banamex or some other bank will fail tomorrow, very likely, nothing is going to happen, nothing at all. If that same prediction is made by some other authority, let's say the Mexican central bank, there are other possibilities. Okay, so it seems to, kind of depending on the authority of the prediction, what's going to happen, right? So where it originates, who makes the prediction, how it will be disseminated, etc. So depending on these things, different things are going to happen. But I think that means that performativity really depends on two things, not one, namely the prediction on the one hand, right? What your prediction says, and something else, something like a causal power, right? That really establishes the prediction's effects, right? But that's typically treated, and this definition is an example of that. This is typically treated as something like a black box. Okay. Now, what I want to do is to open that black box, because I think that leads to a richer kind of conceptual landscape, or a richer way of thinking about performativity. And so my proposal is that we should think of any performative effect as a function of the prediction on the one hand. And again, I use prediction as a placeholder for, it could be explanations, classification, etc. So a function of the predictions issued and their corresponding performative power. Okay, so that's my conceptual proposal. I want to think of any performative effect as a function of the predictions issued and their associated performative power. Of course, that definition is not very helpful if we don't say more about this mysterious concept of performative power. So let me give it a try. So a couple of observations. So, I mean, what I mean with performative power is kind of intuitively, it's the ability to influence the course of events, right? The ability of some prediction to influence things. There's an interesting distinction dating back to Oscar Morgenstern in this book I mentioned at the beginning from 1928. So he says that so your performative power will depend decisively on two things, namely reach and the acceptance of your prediction. So reach simply means the number of people, so the individuals that will become acquainted with the prediction, right? But that's not enough. You also need acceptance, right? So if I'm kind of reached, if I become acquainted with your prediction, do I also believe in it or not? Okay, so it will depend on these two things. So depending on these two things, performative power can be higher or lower. And of course, reach and acceptance will in turn kind of depend on other things like a host of factors such as the influence or the trustworthiness of the scientists issuing the prediction. But I think as a first approximation, I think it's quite helpful to think about reach and acceptance as determining performative power. And then finally, there's a final remark here that there's, I think, an important type token distinction that should be made here, and that hasn't been made anywhere in the literature, at least as far as I'm aware. And so I think it's something like the following. So I think it's a type of prediction that can be said to have performative power. But this performative power will in turn depend on and kind of trickle down through tokens of that same prediction. Okay, so that's kind of the view I want to motivate here. So something like, predictions trickling down through, and you have a type prediction that should be said to be performative, but it will trickle down through the tokens of the prediction. Maybe to give you an example, I mean that might be a bit weird. So suppose, you have an example. So suppose a group of economists predicts that there will be a recession. Okay, so it's done an example. Now, the result of that will be an abstract, so a type of prediction. Okay. Now, when let's say their paper they've written is published, then each of us can, of course, read the paper on our devices. We can print it out. It's even more, it will maybe appear in the news if it's important enough. I will then, read it in the newspaper, watch it on TV, and so on. I can tell you about the prediction. You can tell other people about it. So each of these things will be a token of that very same prediction. Okay, so these are all tokens of the predictions, and the tokens will determine the reach and acceptance of the prediction. Okay, so the tokens will define the performative power of the type of prediction. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just a clarification. So they have to be all linked to testimony or some epistemological link. So all the tokens all the tokens of the same type have to rely on the same evidence in order to be tokens of the same type.
I don't think they need to rely on the very same evidence. So it could be something like, I tell you about something I read in the news, and then you tell Atocha.
Yeah, it seems like it is. It stems from the same evidence.
Okay, but there doesn't have to be a direct acquaintance or something with the. Yeah. There will be causal links, of course, between the studies. Yeah.
You're asking perhaps it's the same source.
Yeah. Thank you. Just like.
Okay, so this is kind of the view that I want to motivate here. With this concept of performative power, we can then now kind of get a grasp or an intuition of what it means to say that prediction has a high or a low performative power. Okay, and I have so I try to do this kind of graphically. Not sure if that's the best way to think about it, but I found it kind of intuitive. So again, you have, let's have a look at this example here. So what this shows is so you have the prediction of the likelihood of a recession again, okay? Some economic prediction. Now, in some particular country, let's say. So on the x-axis, we have, the predicted value from 0 to 1. Okay, so 0 chance of recession to, definitely there will be a recession. So this is your predicted value, your prediction. On the y-axis, we have the actual likelihood of recession occurring, okay? Now, have a look at the dashed line first. So that gives you something like the baseline, okay? So that's the likelihood of a recession in the case where there is no prediction at all. It's simply some objective probability, okay? This will be the chance of recession occurring. And now each of the colored graphs here represents a particular level of performative power. So if my prediction was, suppose first, if my prediction was identical to baseline, I would have 0 performative power, right? So if this is my prediction, no matter what I predict, the value will remain the same. I have 0 performative power. But now the blue one, let's have a look at the blue one first. So here your prediction is slightly performative, so it's slightly self-fulfilling, actually. So the likelihood of recession occurring for low values is in fact a bit lower than baseline. But for high values of your prediction, it becomes a bit higher. Okay, so you have a slightly self-fulfilling prediction here. If you have a look at the red graph, you have essentially the very same shape, only that it's much more extreme. Okay. So I want to say that the red one has higher performative power than the blue one. Okay, so that's my first example. But no, sometimes things are not as nicely continuous. Sometimes there can be some kind of a threshold value where suddenly some movement is set in motion, and so that's my second example here. So suppose here you have the prediction of the likelihood of a bank run occurring, and so here we suppose that that there is a threshold which, when we pass it, bank run is then virtually certain. So the dashed line is again, baseline. So if there's no prediction, the probability is close to 0 of run occurring. In the red graph, it's different. So here, when you pass a value, around, say, 0.5, then suddenly, there's a bank run. And then the difference to the blue graph is that here the threshold is much higher, okay? So here it's about, I don't know, 0.8 or something. Okay, so here the bank run only occurs for very high values of your prediction, whereas it's much more sensitive for the red graph. And here I again want to say that the red graph has more performative power than the blue one, okay? So that's not really a definition, I guess, but well, it's kind of a conceptual clarification of performative power. What is performative power? Well, it's essentially the deviation from baseline, right? So it's essentially how big this area is. So this one plus that one, and that's bigger in the red case than in the blue case, right? In the blue case, it's only this plus that. Hence, the red case has more performative power, okay? So the higher the performative power, the greater your deviation from the baseline, the higher your performative power of your prediction. Okay, is that more or less clear? Any questions? Okay. Now I think we need yet another conceptual distinction, which is that between high performative power versus concentrated performative power. And this is because, so high performative power is, I think, it's nothing that is inherently problematic. Okay? I think even very high values of performative power can be entirely justified. And this is because, so I think in an ideal case, the epistemic value of your prediction and your performative power should really go hand in hand. Okay, so the better the epistemic value of your prediction, the higher should be the chance that your prediction will be heard and acted upon. Okay, so these two things should go hand in hand. So as an example, so of course it's better to believe and to act upon some prediction issued by let's say a group of trustworthy scientists, having passed peer review and some other quality assurance mechanisms in science that you have. I would better believe and act upon such a prediction than some prediction by some quack. Okay, so of course it's kind of trivial that the first should enjoy more kind of higher performative power than the second. Okay? However, the ideal case is, of course, not always the case. So, you could think of cases where the epistemic value of your prediction doesn't align with your performative power. And in that case, I want to say that the result is concentrated or monopolistic power. And I think here is where it gets problematic. So I tried to think about a couple of examples, and so first I have simply some very stylized examples. So these have nothing to do with which have nothing, but simply some stylized examples. So to make the intuition behind concentrated performative power more precise. Okay, and so they are also supposed to show that there are different ways in which performative power can be overly concentrated. So as a first way, it can happen that a single voice of some scientist becomes kind of overly, dominant on a particular matter, and I call that a monopoly. Okay, so it's one kind of concentrated performative power. And so the example I came up with is this. So suppose there's an outbreak of a novel pathogen. Then suppose there's an epidemiologist who is kind of a quack. Okay, so he isn't well regarded in his community. However, so because of his charisma and the right contacts and so on, he's nevertheless consulted as the leading expert by government. Now, that economist predicts that this novel pathogen is relatively harmless and there will be very few, bless you, there will be few deaths. And in response, lockdowns are then retracted and people relax their social distancing behavior and so on. And as a result, the pathogen spreads and there are many deaths. Okay? So in this case, I want to say that the epidemiologist enjoys too much performative power, right? And of course, the policymakers are at fault here because they should have listened to other voices as well, okay? And so this is what I call a monopoly. And so due to this monopolistic status of the epidemiologist, the epidemiologist enjoys kind of overly concentrated performative power. But there are other cases too. One is what I call the tyranny of the majority. So here, rather than a single voice becoming very dominant, you have kind of a majority of voices that all come up with very with very similar predictions. But as a result, some minority voices will be marginalized. And okay, so here, the example I came up with is this. So suppose that a big majority of economists think that public debt will stall growth, and that only some severe austerity politics can recover growth. Okay. As a response to these dominant views, government implements strict austerity measures, citing the broad expert agreement as justification and ignoring some economists that dissent with that prediction. However, while keeping that down, the measures themselves then cause a severe recession. So that's what I call a tyranny. And then one last case, which we can imagine as a monopoly or as a tyranny, would be the following. So here you have some prediction, and so suppose in the monopoly case, some very influential scientist makes the prediction, or in the tyranny case, a big majority of scientists make that prediction. The prediction is this: so policymakers will do what is required to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. But then that prediction induces the policymakers and the public to not worry and do nothing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And that, of course, results in global warming above 1.5 degrees. Now, what's special about this last case, and what I like about it, not surprisingly, what I like about this last case is that here you would actually hope for more rather than fewer performative effects, right? So it's a special case where the monopoly or the tyranny leads to what's I think in psychology called status quo bias. So the propensity to arouse little or no effects, where the better or the correct mechanism would have been to generate more effects. And I find this case nice because, to remove status quo bias, an effective solution would be to find a way to generate predictions that are kind of more formative. So incentivize change rather than encouraging behavior that kind of perpetuates the status quo. How am I doing with time? Oof.
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes? Okay. Then I can skip this. This is basically one of the reviewers that I mentioned at the beginning. As I said, they provided very helpful comments and criticism. But so one of them was criticized that my use of very stylized examples, and argued that these examples aren't really plausible. But And so now I kind of included more real cases, and I think it's actually not very difficult to find real cases. This is one case that is kind of similar to this monopolistic epidemiologist case, and there's one of that resembles more the kind of a tyranny of the majority case. Happy to talk about this in the discussion, but I'll simply skip this for now. Okay, so with that kind of conceptual apparatus, you can probably already see where this argument is going. So I want to now argue, and this is of course intentionally kind of provocative, that performativity can be good for science. And so I want to motivate kind of a more general way of thinking about performativity, which is inspired by the values in science literature, and especially by work by Helen Longino. So maybe some of you have already kind of when I presented the title of my talk, how performativity can be good for science. Maybe some of you, for some of you that sounded familiar, and that's not a surprise because so there's Longino's paper from 2004, how values can be good for science. Okay, so let me just briefly, talk about the what I see as kind of analogous in the two literatures, and where I think the performativity literature should take a similar turn that the values in science literature took recently. And for that end, I want to briefly talk about, I think, one of Longino's main arguments that she makes for values in science. So the backdrop is the value-free ideal, right? So this idea that was once very widely held that non-epistemic, so ethical, political, social values should really be kept out of science. Okay, so that's the value-free idea. I think nowadays philosophers of science have pretty much abandoned this. Some skepticism there, but perhaps not altogether. But anyway, can debate that later on. So I mean, yeah, but also so scientists themselves, I think, are very often still kind of very much adherents to the idea, and also I think some kind of public imaginations of how scientists work are still kind of very much in this tradition. Anyway, so Longino argues that so against this value-free idea. So she first argues that scientific reasoning is inevitably value-laden, and this, of course, goes back to Richard Rudner's argument for inductive risk. But she goes further and argues that so actually what we need to worry about is possible power concentrations and biases rather than about value influences across the board. It's not values as such that's the problem, but it's really specific values or concentrated values. So in particular, hegemonic values that are held by some groups of scientists, of course, groups that are typically white, male, affluent, and so on. That these kinds of values will come to dominate the scientific discourse. And her solution is that values should then actually be sufficiently diverse, right, and should represent a broad range of perspectives and interests. And so what always strikes me as very kind of intriguing about this argument is that the conclusion is that so rather than minimizing the role of values in science, we actually need more of them, right? We need more diverse values. And of course, there are other things like standpoint theory and feminist empiricism are also kind of in line with this broad view and advocate for greater diversity within scientific communities. Okay, so you can probably see where the argument is going now. So might be called Longinian performativity. So I mean, Longino hasn't written about performativity, but I think a similar argument should be made in the context of performativity, which is, so when Longino worries about hegemonic values dominating the scientific discourse, I think similarly, our concern should be concentrated performative power. And so the idea is that just like for Longino, we shouldn't worry about performativity as such. It's not performativity as such that's the problem, but about overly concentrated performative power over how these effects will materialize. So, for example, no, let's skip this. Well, I guess so. If you look at the picture on the right hand side, that should give you an intuition. So here, I mean, I think 9 out of 10 most influential economists you will see are men. Also, 9 out of the 10 are white. But it's then plausible, I think, that it will be these men that will not only dominate the internal discourse, but that they will also dominate the ensuing performative effects. Okay, so when those people issue predictions, then these are the predictions that will get heard and that will be acted upon. And this can produce overly concentrated performative power. Similar to Longino's solution for values, it seems that the voices that get heard and that can kick off performative effects should be sufficiently diverse and should represent a broad range of perspectives and interests. And so it follows from this argument that we need different, or sometimes even more, when you think back to the climate change case, even more performative effects. Okay, so worry not about performativity, worry about performative power. This is the view I want to motivate. Of course, it doesn't follow from this view that then, doesn't imply that anything goes. So again, similar to the recent literature on values in science, I think we need then to find a way to, delineate what are legitimate performative effects from those that aren't legitimate. So this is in a way only that has been called the new demarcation problem, recent paper. So it's really the beginning of a kind of a bigger project rather than the solution to concentrated performative power. In particular, I think this will involve a proper way of allocating responsibility and blameworthiness for performative effects. And here I have something in mind like, think back to my definition of performativity. So it's a function of predictions and the associated performative power. So we will need to allocate responsibility for predictions and for performative power, right? And I think we should argue for something like this, that there should be a broad division of labor where scientists are responsible for their predictions, of course, but there will be a broader political institutional responsibility for breaking power concentrations. It's kind of a I think a neat division of labor that would make sense. Okay, but I will conclude here, and so what I've argued is this. So performativity is typically viewed as a threat, right? I want to motivate a different kind of a revaluation of performativity, in which performativity has a productive role to play in science. So similar development to that of values in science would be desirable. Very often, I think the problem is not performativity as such, but it's really concentrated performative power. Breaking these power concentrations, breaking monopolies, can sometimes arouse different performative effects or even more performative effects. But it's here where performativity is really good for science rather than a threat for science. I conclude here. Thanks a lot. Some references here. just in case.
Maybe you can do the references here at the Institute. We all got the papers anyway. Maria will help us with the colleagues, which is only one connected from outside. And we have 7 questions. So I'll ask, will I be able to make several rounds? So please, you are allowed to make one single question. And
But it's a
if
second
you
round.
would like to make more questions,
Wait a second.
please raise your hand again. Okay, Maria, por favor.
Thanks for it. It's hard to just make one question. So.
One.
Yeah. It was very interesting, but I was left with a huge question between answering the main point here, which is that performativity is good for sciences, because it seemed to me that you made a case for it not being that bad for science, but it wasn't clear to me how it was good, and especially because the idea of performativity at the beginning was very much linked to the hypothesis itself, like the information, and maybe the way in which it was spread. But in the end, it was related to the epistemic authority that was going to endorse that information. And at the beginning, it seemed that there was something specific about the content of those hypotheses that were so relevant for society or something like that. But in the end, that context was, in a sense, lost. And I could get the impression that anybody that is very important or renowned in an epistemic community could endorse any hypothesis, and that could have, in a sense, a sort of a performative power. So can you help me to understand how it is good for science and how it's actually well-rounded the idea of performativity if it's only the hypothesis of the authority?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure if I can help, but I'll give it a try. So first of all, this I mean, the title is supposed to be provocative. Leaning on this Longino style of thinking. Of course, my conclusion is not that performativity is always good for science. I think we need to take a different stance on performativity, which should be related to, or similar. It should be similar to the stance we've recently taken, or at least many of us have recently taken on values, which is, values can be good or bad. Value influences can be good or bad. It's simply not values as such that are the problem. It's not values across the board that are the problem, but rather, various, specific idiosyncratic values. And so I want to argue that, likewise for performativity, it's not performativity as such that's the problem, but it's particular ways in which performativity can be brought about and the results of that. And I think here it's helpful to think about this concept of concentrated performative power. I think part of your question had to do with, I'm not sure if I grasped that correctly, but how it relates kind of to the epistemic dimensions or epistemic aspects of your predictions. I'm going to try to kind of combine these two in this distinction that I made between high performative power versus concentrated performative power. So I do think it can be justified to even enjoy very high levels of performative power, if that links to your kind of the epistemic goodness of your prediction. Whereas once that link is broken, the result will be locally, and that's when we're in trouble. Just like when we're in trouble with hegemonic values held by old white men that become very dominant in scientific discourse. But that's kind of the broad view that I want to motivate. But I'm not sure if that helped at all, but
Okay, thank you.
we'll have a second round.
Second question.
Yes, okay, thank you. Actually, I think it's a little bit of a follow-up of Maria's question, and what you said is helps a little. But let me put it this way. So you're asking whether performativity can be good for science. Let's put it that way, right? You did challenge this received view that it's a threat. And I would like to make a simple distinction and see what you think about this, like very simplistic, between whether performativity can be epistemologically versus ethically, morally good or bad. And with that very simple distinction, we can say that, look, in so far performativity can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, etc., it's a threat to evaluating the truth, the naked truth of hypotheses, theory, etc. So when we try to justify or evaluate a scientific theory or hypothesis, we need some kind of neutrality, and performativity could be a threat there. So it could be a threat or pernicious epistemologically. Now, the fact that publishing results in science or hypotheses can have consequences, social consequences that could be morally good or bad sometimes, it's very interesting. But I'm thinking think of the placebo effect, right? If you're testing a new drug, let's say a painkiller, and the placebo effect relieves pain, that's good. Now, right? On the other hand, you want to be able to test to what extent the placebo effect is what's doing the work there, or the drug actually neutrally, independently from placebo, relieves pain. Can we make a similar distinction to separate the epistemological issue of whether it's a threat or not from the moral issue? Because then we could agree that scientific predictions and publications and results and knowledge, whether a hypothesis is true or is false, can have effects, and we can discuss those effects, and then the discussion is ethical, right? About what are good effects and what are socially bad effects. But would you agree with that simple distinction, or am I being too traditionalist in separating this kind of pure epistemological issue from the moral one?
I'm laughing a bit here because you sound very much like my reviewer tweet. So in my first version of this paper, I think that's actually the version that you sent around. I still make I used to think the analogy between values and performativity is even kind of closer. And so I said something like, this view of performativity as a threat. I call that the performativity-free ideal, right? And analogously to the value-free ideal, of course. And I said, this ideal should be rejected. And then in response to that argument, reviewer 2 said, well, you're giving all sorts of ethical arguments. However, there could still be very important epistemic arguments for performativity-free science. Yeah. And so I first wanted to say something like, let's put it in a footnote, there are these other epistemic considerations. But so I'm not entirely convinced that all epistemic considerations will actually be detrimental. I think performativity can even have epistemically beneficial effects. And so one simple example is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So here, performativity, it's kind of a bad trick, but by means of performativity, your prediction will become true. So that seems to be epistemically advantageous. Anyway, so that was my first idea. Yes, I wanted to put that in a footnote, and then I started thinking about this more, and I think this would be not entirely honest, because I think because I think the distinction is very important, and there might be important things to be said from the epistemology of science for performativity-free science. Okay, so I kind of abandoned that whole project, and I now don't want to say that a performativity-free ideal should be rejected anymore, but I simply try to make this kind of more modest argument that for some political, ethical, but also epistemic reasons, sometimes some formative effects shouldn't be seen as a threat, but might even be epistemically and ethically advantageous, and we should worry about this concept of performative power. So I kind of reframe them now. If that didn't, sorry, if that didn't go through in my talk, is that so the reason for that is that so I'm still kind of in between these two versions. The third part is still kind of a leftover from this old version of the paper, which is much more radical than what I want to do now. So sorry if the result that is a bit embarrassing.
Maybe just like a quick comment to leave it for later for a second round. Maybe we can leave it in it's a question. It's like the placebo, to what we said,
Okay.
just the placebo effect. And maybe like in the placebo effect, you can use it, and it's good that there is placebo effect. And performativity could be in an analogous way good, but you also want to understand scientifically, neutrally, right, and take performativity issues or arises out to understand even the placebo effect. And perhaps with performativity, we can scientifically study it as well, like that, kind of isolate the things. But it's just kind of an idea.
Okay.
Just an idea.
Yeah, that's good.
Before I move to a question by Ambrosio, I would like to remind you that Philippe understands and speaks Spanish very well, so please feel free to raise your question.
Yes.
So don't set the bar too high.
If there's some misunderstanding, we'll translate. Ambrosio.
Thank you very much.
Por favor.
Gracias. Thank you very much. And I will try to, if you accept, I will make my question in Spanish.
Sure, yeah.
Bueno, creo que la pregunta de Esteban me ayuda a exponer más claramente mi pregunta. En primer lugar, I'm very sympathetic with you. Pero yo creo que es necesario, no estoy de acuerdo con esta distinción, sí distinción, pero no diferente consideración de consecuencias epistémicas por un lado y por otro lado. Depende de cuáles sean nuestros valores epistémicos, which are our epistemic values, which is our concept of truth. And, y yo referiría a esta muy larga tradición desde Aristóteles, Marx y hasta hoy, de verdad práctica, ¿no? Versus verdad teórica. No sé si es clara esta idea. El problema es no interpretar al mundo, sino transformarlo. The truth of the pudding is in the pudding. La tesis 11, Machiavelli, ¿no? Verità effettuale de Machiavelli. Así que creo que si se hace esta distinción, y la pregunta es, ¿estarías hablando de verdad, en ese sentido, de verdad práctica, más que de una verdad teórica? Lo cual tiene que ver mucho con nuestra concepción de ciencia. No sé si es clara, porque si hablamos de verdad práctica, no solo valores epistémicos, no solo valores éticos y políticos, también valores epistémicos entrarían. I don't know if I'm clear, or do you want to make a synthesis of the question?
That's the first thing. Was the question clear? Tries to communicate here in different languages, not just the language.
Sí. Supongo que sí, está claro.
You don't have to answer in Spanish.
So what I would like to argue in response to that is that so I agree that this distinction is important. However, I do think that there are cases where ethical values can even override epistemic values. And some cases of performativity are, instances of such cases. And here the distinction in a way breaks down to an extent.
Okay, thank you. So now
About practical versus theoretical truth, I don't know. But I'm not very familiar with the distinction. we can talk about this later.
Aristotle.
Okay, now let's move to Susanna, please.
Thank you. It's a question comment regarding one thing that you didn't mention in the presentation, but it's in the text. And so it regards the notion of responsibility, or this is not the notion, but this idea that scientists have the responsibility for their predictions, including the anticipations of any performative effects. And that is the last part is the thing that I want to comment on. So I would like to point for the importance of interdisciplinarity in predicting the consequences, in anticipating the consequences, and also like using like complex systems tools, because sometimes it's not, maybe an expert in some field cannot anticipate the consequences of the predict, like all the possible consequences, or not all the possible, but many possible consequences of the predictions. So, and this also connects, I think, with the second part of the responsibility, which is in, like the predictive power in choosing the experts that are going to influence. So I think both responsibilities are related in this regard, because choosing the expert may involve like making an interdisciplinary like group or council that can mediate between them. So that's how do you think that this could be included, or if you think this should be included?
Yes, I think I like that actually, because I make this these arguments concerning responsibility, that we need to kind of distribute responsibilities properly. I make that partly in response to some views that deny that there are such responsibilities. Okay, and these views typically argue that. I think hacking would say something similar to that. That these effects are so difficult to foresee, to predict, that we can't meaningfully allocate responsibilities for evoking those effects. But I want to say something like this is too quick. I think in many cases you are able and you should be able to foresee the consequences of what you predict. But I think what you say, interdisciplinary research, engaging with other scientists from other fields, I think that might even give me more ammunition to make that case. So even if one scientist from a particular scientist from the field might not be able to foresee that in a particular instance, some others might. And then there might be some responsibility for teaming up to evaluate the consequences of your research. So thanks for that. Yeah, it's helpful.
Great. Guadalupe, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really enlightening to me to think about values in social science and how especially predictions could be problematic in this reviewed with values and knowledge. I am thinking mainly about scientific models. I'm not very familiar with scientific models in social science, but I think that the question could apply. The aim of your talk was to show that performativity could have a productive role in science. And you said that performativity is an effect of certain predictions or other products of science on phenomena. I think that the problem here is, as you said in some moment, the problem here is to establish how to demarcate the legitimate performativity role of these predictions, for example. But I think that you didn't say that in your talk, and you didn't establish particularly that. You said that do you have a legitimate role of performativity if epistemic value of predictions aligned with the performativity power? So I think that I will deepen that. That's the criteria to say that performativity role is a legitimate one or not. I will like to hear a little bit more about that. I think that that's the main point, to say that there is a productive role of performativity in science. And I add something more. I think that maybe performativity could be the effect that some products of science has on this phenomena or objects, but maybe that depends on the sensibility of the target and not about the prediction itself. I don't know if that introduced something more to you. Thank you very much.
Good, thanks. I think that's very interesting. So on the first one, I would actually go back to Esteban's suggestion that. So I would argue something like when we think about demarcation, we can think about epistemic versus ethical ways of demarcating. Legitimate versus illegitimate instances of formativity, depending on which kind of route you want to take. And I think you can find different routes in the literature, not explicitly stated, but implicitly. So depending on which route you take, different instances will come out legitimate or not. So the epistemic route is sometimes called in economics. There's a active research field which tries to endogenize the effects of your prediction. Okay, so that means so you try to, in your prediction, you try to anticipate the effects of your prediction and kind of steer them in such a way that the outcomes will be aligned with what you predict. Okay. There's kind of endogenizing. So people, that's the epistemic route, right? And so people in that tradition would say, well, as long as we're able to endogenize, there's no problem. Okay? So those are legitimate instances. When we're not able, then there's a problem. Now, on the ethical side, so here people would argue something like, endogenizing is not always kind of the solution to everything. One, because the ways in which we steer these effects might be bad, that might be socially, politically desirable. And they would also make the case that these ethical questions don't go away with endogenize things. So I'm more leaning to the, not surprisingly, the ethical camp of demarcating. But I think these are the two kind of options. I don't know. Does that say anything?
Yeah, maybe in the second round I can add something about that.
If it's a brief comment,
I'm not completely agree that are separated things like the moral effects and the epistemic effects, because I think that all the point of the inductive risk argument is that both things are together. So, and especially in social science and medical science, I think that both things are together. In some levels in like science, like physics, that's something that you can separate in some sense. But I think in this kind of effects, I think that two components are together, and that's something that the inductive risk argument shows. I don't know. You accept it or not, or what version of it, but we can continue. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm personally not too sympathetic to that. I do think people also on the values literature. I think it's a helpful distinction. It can be attacked, of course, but it's a helpful distinction that's kind of implicit in this whole field is the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. I think something similar should be said in formativity case. Some people argue that there are cases where there's really no. There's a paper on climate predictions, for example. So depending on what you predict, you either end up in a tragedy of the commons or a more cooperative solution. And so you can either predict A or B, but there's kind of no objective matter of fact, because there's only, you can only predict. And by predicting, you produce the very thing. So here, this would be one of those cases where the two things kind of collapse. Right? So there's no way of kind of comparing your prediction with the objective outcomes. I'm not. I'm not too convinced that these examples are. I mean, I'm more leaning to the inductive risk argument. I think some people argue that there are cases where there's really no. So depending on what you predict, you either end up in a tragedy of the commons or a more cooperative solution. And so you can either predict A or B, but there's kind of no objective matter of fact, because there's only, you can only predict. And by predicting, you produce the very thing. So here, this would be one of those cases where the two things kind of collapse. Right? So there's no way of kind of comparing your prediction with the objective outcomes. I'm not too convinced that these examples are They strike me as quite exotic.
Thank you.
Okay, just, to know, are there questions in YouTube or in the chat?
No, in YouTube there are not, and in the chat it doesn't look like there is anything.
Great. Now it's Fernando's, but we'll. Say something.
No, para apuntar a esta. Perfecto. No, no.
Fernando hace y ya.
Ah, pensé que no estaba en la lista, perdón.
Bueno, es una pregunta.
For the first second round. Fernando, por favor.
So thank you, this was very interesting. I have a question less about ethical and epistemological implications and more on the second part of the presentation, on about what we understand as performance and power.
Oh, yeah.
So the focus of your definition was mainly on the scientists making the predictions, right? On their trustworthiness, etc. And I think there might be a factor here that heavily complicates things. And I'd like to hear what you think about it. It's not so much about the scientists making the predictions, but about how certain systems, or I don't know what to call them, like people respond to them, right? So firstly, there's the aspect of volatility, right? So that there are certain systems that are more prone to respond to a prediction. And I think that one isn't very problematic, particularly, but I think there's a second one that might be, and that's that there's an additional disparity in how we respond to performative power that affects the capacity or the willingness of a system to respond to certain predictions based on biases on the other direction, right? So, for example, let's say I'm heavily invested in the smoking industry, right? And I see a prediction that diminishes the negative health effects of smoking. I am not only more willing to believe that prediction, but I'm also more willing to promote it. And if I'm in a powerful position to promote that prediction, then I am on an opposite direction. I'm sort of pushing for the performative power of that prediction, based on my let's say like interests, like my social interests, right? So then I think that complicates things because it doesn't seem to really just be a scientific problem, right? In how we treat performativity in science, but really a social problem in the sort of incentive structures for promoting certain predictions and who's empowered to promote those predictions. And yeah, so I'd like to hear what you think about it, because I think that things makes things like a lot more complicated.
Yeah. I think that relates to the question of what's the entity that you attribute power to. I had a long, I mentioned I had a couple of walks here in the campus, and one of those walks, I think I really thought about this question, because my first intuition was, I think about performative power, is that scientists have enjoyed performative power. There's some, I don't know, star from Harvard will perhaps enjoy more performative power than some person from Leibniz University. But that brings various problems with it. One of the problems is that it's typically not scientists. The scientists know that makes a prediction, but in teams of scientists. And then there are all these sorts of social factors that I think you mentioned, and that's one of those. There might be other people involved to promote a certain prediction, a certain line of thinking, and then things get kind of too convoluted. And so my solution was to say, okay, it's not a scientist that should be promoted for power, but rather the prediction itself. And then once you do that, I think the problem in a way appears, because all these social issues are, they're within the notion of performative power. So why something enjoys, why some prediction becomes very powerful. I don't know, that will depend on your case, and your case is an interesting one, right? But so I think for this conceptual tool, it's in a way orthogonal, I think. This conceptualization of form of power as pertaining to a prediction towards the science of the surface.
Thank you, Axel.
How comes Walton?
I'm not gonna go, but I'm gonna go back to the ontology of what is a prediction, what you're calling, what is. And yes, it's true because it's a speech act theory. You're right. That's true. So yeah, so predictions are a speech act, and you have the distinction between type and tokens, right? So, and in a certain sense, you're saying, well, what is important is more the type, because all the tokens of the same type are altogether the ones that have the performative effects, right? As far as understood, or do you mean like sometimes it's going to be important to look at the token, sometimes it's going to be important to look at the type, or okay, maybe the first one is a question of maybe I'm confused because of the face you're making. Because what I understood is that what was important was the type, right? Because its effects are going to be reduced by also all the tokens that are going to be repetitions. However, then when you give the examples and you talk about the majority, the power of the majority, it seems clear to me that the sense in which it can be, it doesn't need to, has to be the same prediction in the sense of being different tokens of the same prediction type. All that is necessary there is that the semantic content is the same, that what is predicted the same. So then in that sense, the type token distinction that you had used earlier is not going to be helpful. We're not going to need to individuate predictions in a different way.
Not sure if I understand the role. So the view I want to motivate is something like, it's not that the type is more important than the tokens. I want to say, so the question is, what is the entity that has formative power?
Yes.
Right? And so I want to say it's type of prediction.
Okay, yeah.
But it's of course through the various tokens that the type will come to enjoy formative power.
Yeah, but in the problem is in the case of the majority, there doesn't seem that what is having the predictive power is actually a token, because they can be different types of different tokens of different types that can create a majority as long as they are making the same prediction, saying that they have the same semantic content. They don't have to come from the same root, you know, in a sense. So then it seems like there it is not the token that they are the types that have the predictive power.
So I think it's of course a stylized example, right?
I'm sorry?
It's of course a stylized example of the reality. But I think in the example, I really assume that there's one prediction made by a majority of people, but there's one and the same prediction, with exactly same semantic content that will be distributed to through bunch of tokens.
Axel's point is that the origin of that content is diverse among the community, and so that indicates in a sense that they are not coming from the same type of source. So Axel and I have convergent predictions, but we have never talked to each other. We didn't read the same thing. So in that sense, what matters there is the content.
Same type.
Yeah, okay, then types are individuated by the content, no longer, as you had said before, by the source. And that's why the ontology.
Yeah, I wouldn't speak individuated types by the source of wherever they come from. No.
Thank you.
We can
say something else? Okay. Now, Julian, for favor.
Thank you, Professor Philippe, for your great talk and paper. I have a question about the responsibility of single scientists about performative power. First of all, you said in your paper that scientists must be responsible of not only their predictions, but also in some sort of the effects, potential performative effects of those predictions. And of course, the Hacking's argument or contra-argument is to say that it's very difficult to foresee those effects, performative effects. But also, even if I can foresee those effects, let's say I do a prediction, and then maybe I know that if I predict that we are going to have a crisis, and that prediction makes public, and then there is a riot or whatever, I can say as a scientist, well, I'm responsible of doing good science in the sense of good whatever predictions. And in the same sense, this is the last part, in the same sense you said the responsibility or the predictive power or performative power of a single scientist outside its community must depend only on merit and not on contextual factors and so on. But I was thinking about that. Well, and first of all, merit may be defined as a byproduct of not only epistemic but also non-epistemic values. And in other way of seeing it, maybe a scientist can say, yes, I am not the most important scientist in this area just because I'm an outsider. So I'm against the tyranny of the majority, against the monopoly of da-da-da. How can we deal with that little tension? That's all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I think your first example is another case where performativity kind of drives a wedge between the epistemic and ethical aspects of your prediction. And here I would say that there are various ways. Of course, it will depend on the kind of demarcation procedure you're favoring. What the solution to this is. So I agree that many scientists will have perhaps the intuition to say, my task here is epistemic in nature. So even if that leads to socially undesirable consequences, I want to produce a true prediction. But in response to that, you could say that there are various ways to seeking to align these two things. I mean, it's not typically that you make one prediction and then this will be true or not. But in the performative world, it might be possible to endogenize various effects, to steer effects in various directions. And then why not trying to combine these two considerations by steering them in a direction that is socially desirable, but at the same time your prediction will come out true. Sometimes this might not always be possible, but sometimes you might enjoy the best of both worlds. So that might be one way of answering it. So don't worry.
Thank you.
Your second one, sorry.
No, it was only one. About the responsibility of scientists and the idea of my performative powers, let's say as a scientist outside the community, should depend only on my merits. But I said to you, well, maybe merits are the byproduct of epistemic and non-epistemic factors, and also people that maybe they don't have those merits. Maybe it's because, or they will say it's because they are outsiders, they are against the monopoly, the current view, and maybe that could be good for diversity of performative powers against the idea of the merit. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so before we go into the second round, let me finish this first round with my comment and question. Well, I would like now to take the title of one of the other papers that you mentioned, which is When is Lockdown Justified? And I think the point here with performativity is not just to see what the performativity power is, but when to apply that power. And my question here is, it's not just when, but how to, so you speak about power, so that suggests me there's somehow a way to measure it. But of course, we don't know how powerful is going to be a prediction until it's effective. What is the role here? Not so much of the performativity, but of the prediction itself. Because I can see you don't want to get so much into risk and all that, but of course, the so to speak, the quality of the prediction is really important. So it's not just who talks about this prediction, but how powerful is the prediction. So I am aware it's not a precise question, but still I'd like to ask you to comment on that. Just one thing, you say is performativity is a function of prediction and performative power.
Mhm.
How is that function works? I mean, and in particular, what's the weight for the prediction itself?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very abstract conceptual proposal I'm making in this paper. I don't provide any way of measuring this thing that's got form of power. And that being said, I wouldn't. So I guess so first of all, as an abstract kind of philosophical conceptual tool, I don't worry too much about that question, at least as of now, because I think it improves on the literature and addresses a couple of gaps in the literature where these effects are really in a way treated in an even more abstract manner because they're simply treated as a black box, right? There's something there's a prediction and then something that happens. I think once you say something about there's a prediction which can be evaluated, epistemic merit be looked at, analyzed, and there's something like causal power it has, then I think you're able to look at a couple of more problems that if you leave that box closed. That being said, I do think there could be measures of performative power. Because there will be an ex ante ex post distinction. So I completely agree that ex ante will be very difficult to anticipate the performative power if you're predicting the failure of that bank. Even there, I think it's not. I think there are. It's not me that I didn't invent this notion of performative power. I'm just trying to bring it kind of to the attention of philosophical science. And in fact, there are a couple of economists and especially computer scientists who think about the power of algorithms. Not so much in the context of scientific contexts, but for example, how much power the Google has. And they came up with kind of clever ways of measuring that, and I think it might not be impossible to kind of adapt these ways to the context of science.
Thank you. Well, we have
Second round.
4 minutes for the second round. Ask first Julian if he has another question because you were the last.
No, thank you. That was all. Thank you.
Then students. I want students with questions, of course, who would like to ask something. Or colleagues or postdocs, but whoever hasn't asked yet and did have a sandwich already.
Two sandwiches.
Yeah.
So in that case, I will ask for the second round to raise the questions and then you close with the 2-3 questions. Whatever you want to answer. So it's Maria, Susana, y Esteban. No? You all have
I think it's related to what Atocha was asking about whether this evaluation of performative power can only happen after and only about individual cases, because it seems that at the beginning the intuition that at least Atocha and I shared is that the topic of the prediction was going to be informative about how it could be impacting society and general interest and so on. But later on in the talk, it seemed that actually applied that too much, and so the topic was not that informative anymore. And so there is a sense in which it seems that what we can only say is after the effect has happened and performative has occurred, then we can evaluate the scenario and say that maybe what happened was that the power here was not well distributed, or the scientific community didn't engage that much, but it was the government or whatever. But it can only help us to analyze post fact and never like get intuitions about what can happen in this new scenario, because we don't have epistemic transparency about how the perception of the prediction might be and how other interests might take place in that evaluation and so on and so forth. So maybe you have any thoughts on that, and I would be happy to hear.
Susanna, please, before.
Oh, taking a.
Yeah,
Oh.
we will take those. No, we just
But I have. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, sorry that I was not so clear.
Okay,
Susanna.
mine has to do with the notion of performative power, that you said that it depends on how big the deviation from the baseline is.
Yeah.
But the second graph that you presented, it doesn't have to do mainly with that deviation, but with the threshold. Like it took longer to like a higher value to come up. Yeah, to come in. So it's not only deviation, but you presented it was just a comment really.
Okay. Yeah, I think the second question is simple. Still the deviation from the baseline. So what you do is you simply measure the area that's different. So the area between your prediction and the baseline. And the greater that is, the greater your power. It doesn't matter whether you have this kind of continuous, slightly continuous case or discontinuous case. So it's a measure the area. Yeah. And on the first one, I would again point out that it might not be possible to do even ex ante evaluation of that, and some people are in fact doing that. But I would also say that even ex post this can be important, important work. If you think about there's a big literature that partly contributes to that literature, but the our kind of scientific but also policy reaction to COVID. Was all that literature, was that all justifiable? Back then, these lockdowns that were based on very shaky epidemiological models, at least in part, were they justified? Because all that kind of evaluation is exposed, right? So I would simply argue that exposed can be can also be very difficult, but
Wonderful. So one last comment before we say thank you to our speaker. So please check his homepage, only to see that he has a very nice photograph of the Mercado de San Felipe. It's a really nice photograph. So thank you everyone for coming, and we may want to have some cake if there is a still sleep.